Captain Dante Kane leads his fearless crew to Skull Reef, lured by the legendary treasure of the long-dead pirate king, Alastor Crow. But when they seize a cursed ruby, Crow's ghostly fleet rises from the deep, sparking a relentless pursuit that tests loyalty, courage, and sanity. Haunted by betrayal and supernatural terror, Kane and his crew must fight to survive as past sins resurface and doom looms closer. Will they escape Crow's vengeance, or is Kane's ambition sealing their fate? Can they reclaim their freedom before it's too late? The night was thick with storm clouds, turning the sea into a shadowed chasm as lightning cracked and waves crashed against the Widow's fury. At the helm, Captain Dante Kane squinted through the downpour, steering his ship with the intensity of a man who didn't know fear, or didn't care for it. His crew shouted as the reef came into view, a silhouette of craggy rocks that tore through the waves like the spine of some ancient beast. There it was, Skull Reef, and hidden within lay the forbidden treasure of Captain Alastor Crow, the long-dead pirate king whose name was spoken only in curses and warnings. Kane's voice cut through the wind. "Hold the course, lads. That gold is ours." But even as he shouted, a murmur ran through the crew. They knew the stories as well as he did. Any man who laid hands on Crow's treasure was said to be doomed, his soul taken to join the ranks of the cursed. Lightning flashed again, illuminating a carved rock that loomed over them, a skull with hollow eyes and a mocking grin. Kane felt the weight of his ambition, yet he'd come too far to turn back. His crew exchanged wary glances, faces set and shoulders tense, each man gripped by the knowledge that whatever lay ahead could take their lives, or worse, their souls. Thunder boomed as the Widow's fury pushed through the final waves, scraping against the reef until they reached a sliver of beach hidden within a cove. The crew disembarked cautiously, swords drawn, eyes darting across the fog-drenched landscape. Ancient skeletons lay half-buried in the sand, hands still curled around rusted swords. It was as if they'd died defending something worth the ultimate sacrifice. "Fan out," Kane commanded, scanning the horizon. His first mate, Bryn Stone, a giant of a man with skin hardened by years under the sun, moved to his side, gaze sharp. Bryn was loyal, but not a fool. He'd followed Kane on countless raids, but this was different. "Captain, this feels wrong," Bryn muttered. "Men say Crow guards his treasure still." Kane gave a bitter chuckle, tightening his grip on his cutlass. "Dead men guard nothing, Bryn." But as they moved toward the ruined temple, Bryn couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes watched them. The crew moved in tight formation, weapons ready, senses sharp. They entered the temple, its stone walls carved with strange symbols that seemed to writhe in the torchlight. At the center lay a stone pedestal covered in coins, gems, and a single haunting artifact, the blood ruby of Crow, glowing a faint, malevolent red. Kane's eyes locked onto the ruby. Ignoring the warnings etched in his mind, he reached for it, fingers curling around the cool stone. The moment he lifted it from the pedestal, a shudder ran through the temple, and the distant echoes of groaning wood and creaking metal filled the air. Then from outside came a sound that chilled the men to the bone, the steady rhythm of drums as if calling to battle. Bryn stiffened. "Captain, we've got company," Kane sneered, pocketing the ruby. "Let them come." The crew, gripping their weapons, backed out of the temple, their faces grim. But the beach they'd left behind was no longer empty. Phantom shapes moved in the mist, figures in torn coats and boots, eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Captain Alastor Crow's crew had risen, answering the call of the stolen ruby. Their spectral forms drifted forward, the air turning cold as the men of flesh and blood stood frozen, transfixed by the faces of those who had once lived and died for Crow. Kane lifted his cutlass, voice defiant. "Back to the ship. We'll cut through 'em." The crew needed no further urging. They sprinted across the beach, slashing at the specters that reached for them with bony hands. Cold seeped through their skin where the spirits brushed against them, chilling them to their core. Panic spread as some men began to falter, eyes widening with terror as the undead closed in. Bryn fought his way to Kane's side. "We've brought a curse upon ourselves, Captain. We need to leave that gem." But Kane's eyes glinted with greed, the ruby's red glow reflecting in his gaze. "A fortune like this, no one abandons it." They made it to the Widow's fury, scrambling up the gangplank, just as the undead pirates reached the ship's hull. Kane barked orders, and the crew struggled to haul anchor and set sail. But as the ship pulled away from the cove, the phantom crew did not fade. Their ghostly forms clung to the water, following in the ship's wake, their hunger undiminished. Then, from the fog, a new shape emerged, a massive ship with tattered sails and a broken mast. It was Crow's flagship, risen from the depths, manned by an army of cursed souls. The drums grew louder, beating in rhythm with the ship's approach. Panic spread among the crew as the Widow's fury struggled to outrun the supernatural vessel. They fired their cannons, but each shot passed harmlessly through Crow's ship, which glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light. Desperation clawed at them as they realized they faced not just any ship, but a force beyond the living's understanding. Kane's voice rang out, "Faster! We need to get out of this cursed water!" But even as they sailed, the undead closed in, spectral hands reaching through the mists to clutch at the ship's hull. And at the helm of the ghostly ship, the skeletal figure of Alastor Crow himself loomed, his empty eye sockets fixed upon Kane. Just as the drums reached a deafening crescendo, the sea split beneath them, and from the depths rose monstrous shadows, wraith-like sea serpents that swirled around the cursed ship, protecting it. Kane's face turned pale as he realized the full extent of his peril. But there was one last hope, a way to break free of Crow's wrath. Bryn, desperate, turned to Kane. "Throw the ruby overboard, Captain. Release it or we're all lost." Kane hesitated, eyes darting between the ruby and the monstrous forms closing in. With every second he waited, his crew grew more desperate, the fear palpable. Bryn's voice rose above the howling wind, his face twisted in anger and terror. "Captain, it's not worth our lives." Kane's grip tightened, but in a flash of clarity, he knew he couldn't hold on to the cursed gem without dooming them all. With a roar, he hurled the ruby overboard, watching as it sank into the dark depths below. For a moment, all was still. Then, one by one, the ghostly shapes began to fade, sinking back into the depths. Crow's flagship drifted into the fog, vanishing as the curse lifted. Silence fell over the crew, each man staring out into the sea with the weight of the night's events heavy upon them. The treasure was gone, but they were alive. Yin, his hand still clutching the hilt of his cutlass, stared into the water, where the ruby had vanished. The crew around him exchanged looks of silent relief and resentment. They had survived Skull Reef, but the memory of that night, of Crow's haunting gaze, would follow them for as long as they sailed. The storm subsided, leaving the Widow's fury bobbing on the eerie stillness of the cursed waters. The crew, battered but alive, sagged against the railings, their breath rising in clouds of mist as the unnatural cold seeped into their bones. Captain Dante Kane, however, was anything but at ease. His hand had cast away the ruby, but his heart still pounded with the thrill and the regret of losing such a prize. He stood at the helm, staring into the rolling mist that had swallowed Crow's undead fleet, his mind haunted by Crow's face and the glow of that cursed stone. The sea was quiet, almost too quiet. Bryn Stone, the first mate, crossed his arms, watching Kane with a mixture of relief and suspicion. Bryn had followed the captain for years, had trusted him with his life more times than he could count. But tonight's events had carved a deep rift. He approached Kane, voice low. "Captain, we've risked our lives and seen things that'll haunt us forever. For what? A cursed treasure?" Kane turned, his eyes flashing. "We came back alive, didn't we? And since when does a little brush with death scare you, Bryn?" Bryn gritted his teeth. "Death? No. But curses? The crew's lost faith, Captain. They've seen what greed brings." "Greed?" Kane let out a harsh laugh. "Or ambition? Crow's treasure is only lost to those who fear it. If you lack the spine, you're welcome to leave my ship. But mark my words, there's a fortune waiting for those brave enough to take it." A murmur of discontent rippled through the crew, lingering just beyond Kane's notice. Some glanced toward the waves, the memory of Crow's ghostly crew fresh in their minds. Others looked toward Bryn, who seemed to hold the heart of the men. For the first time, the unbreakable loyalty of Kane's crew was cracking, and he sensed it. Days passed, and Kane's mind began to fester with thoughts of the treasure he'd abandoned. Nightmares of Crow's face haunted him, whispering of riches and power beyond measure. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the ruby gleaming beneath the waves, as if calling to him, taunting him. He would wake drenched in sweat, his gaze fixed toward the cursed waters behind them. One morning, as dawn broke, Kane called his crew to the deck. His voice rang out with renewed fervor. "Men, we've tasted the edge of destiny, and I say it's time we seize it. Skull Reef holds treasures beyond Crow's curse. I know the risks, but I also know that fortune favors the bold." The crew stood in silence, some shuffling uneasily. Bryn narrowed his eyes, catching a glint of madness in Kane's gaze. "Captain, are you suggesting we return to Skull Reef?" "Yes!" Kane's voice was fierce. "We escaped Crow once. His curse can be broken. And when it is, there will be enough gold for every man here to be richer than kings." A murmur of excitement mixed with doubt spread through the men. Some, tempted by the promise of fortune, exchanged hopeful glances. Others shook their heads, whispering to each other about Crow's wrath. Bryn stepped forward, his face dark. "You're leading us to ruin, Kane. You saw what happened last time. Crow won't rest easy. He'll drag us all to the depths before letting us steal from his tomb again." Kane's eyes blazed. "Cowards and fools are no use to me. Anyone who doesn't have the guts to face Crow's curse is free to leave my crew." For a tense moment, no one moved. Bryn's jaw clenched, but he held his ground. "I'll stay. But remember, Captain, some curses can't be broken." As the days passed, a strange presence seemed to settle over the ship. Shadows flickered where they shouldn't, and whispers filled the night, voices that echoed of things long dead. The crew began to speak of the ghost drums, a phantom beat that drummed through the quiet nights, growing louder as they sailed closer to Skull Reef. The younger sailors, like Rafe and Jin, grew nervous, constantly casting glances over their shoulders. Rafe, barely 18 and fresh to the pirate's life, muttered to Jin as they worked the deck. "Do you hear it, Jin? That beat. It feels like someone's watching." Jin, a hardened sailor with a missing finger, gave him a grim nod. "Aye, lad. Crow's watching us all, waiting for us to make a mistake." One evening, the drumming grew so loud that it seemed to shake the planks underfoot. Bryn went to Kane's quarters, finding the captain awake and staring into the night, eyes blazing with something wild. "Captain, this has to stop. The men are on edge, half of them jumping at shadows. They hear things, see things. This curse will tear us apart before we reach the reef." Kane's gaze didn't waver. "Do you fear old ghost stories, Bryn? We're pirates, not children." "I fear what I've seen with my own eyes," Bryn said firmly. "And I don't need a second encounter with Crow to know he's more than a story." But Kane waved him off. "We're too close to turn back. Fortune demands sacrifice, and I'll not be stopped by a handful of cowards." Bryn shook his head. He knew Kane wouldn't stop, not until he had either seized the cursed treasure or lost everything to it. The next day, as Skull Reef appeared once more on the horizon, the drumming ceased. An eerie calm settled over the ship, as if the sea itself were holding its breath. Kane stood at the helm, a gleam of triumph in his eyes, while Bryn and the crew prepared themselves for the unknown. This time, however, they were not alone. As they closed in on the reef, a ship appeared through the fog, a vessel that seemed almost transparent, with sails tattered and hanging like wisps of shadow. The crew recoiled in horror as they recognized it. Crow's flagship, manned by the cursed souls of his crew, eyes glowing with the same blue fire that had haunted their memories. The ghostly ship pulled alongside, its deck filled with spectral figures, and at its helm, the figure of Crow himself stood, his empty eyes fixed on Kane. Crow's voice, cold as the depths, echoed across the waves. "You dare return, mortal? To steal what is mine?" Kane raised his cutlass defiantly. "The gold was never yours to keep, Crow. I'll take what's owed to me, curse or no curse." Crow's eyes narrowed, a grim smile playing across his decayed face. "Then face the wrath of the sea, Captain Kane. None escape me twice." As if on cue, the fog thickened, wrapping around the widow's fury and blocking out the sun. Shadows moved within it, spectral hands reaching out, icy tendrils grasping at the men. Shouts of terror filled the air as the crew fought against the cold grip of the undead. "Fire the cannons!" Kane bellowed. But as they fired, the cannonballs passed through the ghost ship, vanishing into the mist. Despair began to settle over the crew as they realized their weapons were useless against these spectral enemies. Bryn, seeing the hopelessness in their fight, shouted to the crew, "We've got to turn back. The reef's cursed, and Crow's not letting us escape this time." But Kane, gripped by greed and defiance, refused to listen. "I'll not leave empty-handed. Forward, men. We're taking that gold, even if it costs us our lives." The crew hesitated, torn between loyalty to their captain and the terror that gnawed at their hearts. Bryn, furious, grabbed Kane's arm. "Enough, Kane! This curse will be the end of us all!" Kane wrenched his arm free, his eyes wild. "Then die a coward, Bryn. But I will not. That treasure is mine." With one last desperate attempt, Bryn gathered the men willing to defy Kane's command and moved to steer the ship back. But the cursed ship and Crow's crew blocked their path, surrounding them on all sides. They were trapped, left with nothing but the icy grip of death drawing nearer. A bone-chilling voice echoed from Crow's ship, its promise unmistakable. "The sea takes what it is owed, Kane, and you will pay." The final stretch to Skull Reef lay before them, but the cost of this cursed pursuit was more than they could bear. And as the drumming returned, louder than ever, the line between the living and the dead blurred. The mist thickened, swirling around the Widow's fury like the grip of a spectral hand. The ship seemed trapped between two worlds, a forsaken vessel sailing the boundary of life and death. All around them, the sea echoed with the sinister rhythm of drums, a beat that drove fear deep into the hearts of every crew member who still clung to life. They were no longer men, but hunted souls, caught in the grasp of Captain Alastor Crow's curse. Captain Dante Kane stood defiantly at the helm, his face twisted with a mix of defiance and obsession. His eyes gleamed with the memory of the ruby he'd tossed into the sea, an action that had bought them only a temporary reprieve. Now, Kane believed that the curse had returned not because of their transgression, but because the sea itself was jealous, withholding the fortune that rightfully belonged to the living. "Crow thinks he can frighten us," Kane shouted above the relentless drumming, his voice barely cutting through the mounting roar of the supernatural storm building around them. "But we're taking that gold, men. Curse or no curse." Bryn Stone, the loyal first mate whose faith in Kane had cracked like a ship's hull against the reef, pushed through the chaotic deck to reach his captain. "Enough of this madness, Kane. You've led us to the gates of the afterlife itself. For the sake of your soul and the souls of your men, we must turn back." Kane shoved him away. "I didn't come this far to turn back. If you fear the dead, then stay behind, Bryn. But I'll claim the riches owed to me." The crew shifted uneasily, the fear in their eyes now mingling with resentment. They'd followed Kane through storms, battles, and the treacherous waters of Skull Reef. But this was different. The mist parted briefly, and Crow's spectral flagship loomed beside them, its ghostly masts towering over the Widow's fury. The cursed ship seemed to draw closer, as if beckoning them to surrender to the depths. As Crow's ship closed in, the mist thinned just enough for the crew to glimpse the faces of its ghostly crew, pirates of old, their faces twisted in eternal agony, their eyes empty hollows that bore the weight of centuries. Crow himself stood at the helm, a figure of decayed grandeur, his skeletal hand pointing toward Kane with grim finality. A voice that was neither entirely human nor of the living whispered across the water, filling the air with dread. "You sought the treasure of the damned, Dante Kane. Now the sea will claim you." At that moment, a powerful wind surged across the ship, and the drumming grew louder, the beat pounding like a relentless heartbeat. The sea around them began to bubble and churn, and from the depths, more ghostly figures rose, spectral hands reaching up toward the ship, clinging to the edges of the hull. Each figure was a lost soul, pirates who had once sailed under Crow's banner, cursed to serve him in death as they had in life. Panic spread across the crew like wildfire. Some drew their swords, knowing that steel would do nothing against the dead. Others fell to their knees, clutching relics and muttering prayers. Kane, unmoved, raised his cutlass and roared, "Fight them! We'll send every cursed soul back to the depths." But as he swung his blade, it sliced through empty air, passing harmlessly through the ghostly figures. The crew watched in horror as their captain's blade failed, and despair settled over them like a shroud. Bryn seized Kane's shoulder, desperation in his voice. "There's no fighting them, Kane. We need to abandon this quest, now, before it's too late." Kane's face contorted with rage. "And leave the gold. You'd throw away the fortune that lies only a breath away?" Bryn shouted back, voice fierce with conviction. "The only thing waiting for us here is death, Captain. The treasure is lost, and it's high time we let it go." But as the argument raged, the ghostly hands tightened their grip on the ship, and the weight of the cursed crew began to drag the Widow's fury lower into the water. The deck creaked, groaning under the strain as the ghostly weight pulled them toward the depths. Just then, one of the crew members, Rafe, young and trembling, shouted, "Look!" His finger pointed to the water beyond the cursed crew, where a strange shape was rising. A monolith of rock etched with symbols older than any of them could comprehend. It was an ancient marker, a remnant of Crow's kingdom, and at its peak glowed the faint light of the blood ruby, resting like an eye watching over the cursed waters. Bryn's eyes widened. The ruby, it's the source. That stone's binding them to this realm. The men stared in horror as the ruby seemed to pulse with each beat of the ghostly drums. It had risen from the depths as if summoned by their intrusion, drawn back to its resting place to oversee Crow's vengeance. Kane's eyes lit with a wild determination. That's it. The key to ending the curse. If we take it, Crow and his crew will be bound to the sea, and the treasure will be ours. Bryn's face hardened. Or it will doom us all. The ruby is Crow's curse itself. If we touch it, we may never return. But Kane had already made up his mind. He ordered the crew to lower a longboat, his voice carrying an edge of mania. To the rock. We take the ruby and the sea will be ours. The longboat hit the water, and Kane and a small party, including Bryn, who refused to let his captain go alone, rowed toward the monolith. The ghost ship loomed behind them, Crow's crew watching in silence as the intruders approached the ruby's resting place. They climbed the rock, each step echoing with a chill that seemed to reach into their souls. As they neared the ruby, Bryn whispered, "We're crossing a line, Captain. Some things aren't meant for the living," Kane scoffed. "Cowards believe that. I'm claiming my destiny." He reached out, his fingers brushing the ruby's surface. The moment he touched it, a shockwave of cold energy surged through him, and the sky turned black. Lightning crackled overhead, striking the sea around them as the drums grew deafening. The monolith shook and Kane clutched the ruby, his face a mask of triumph mixed with terror. But as he lifted the ruby, the ghostly crew surrounding them erupted in howls of fury. Crow's ship surged forward, spectral sails unfurling as it charged toward them, an unstoppable force of the cursed dead. Bryn grabbed Kane's arm, shouting above the roar, "Let it go, Kane, release it or we'll never make it back." Kane's grip tightened, defiance and greed filling his gaze. "No, this power is mine." But in that moment, Crow himself appeared beside them, a skeletal hand reaching toward Kane, his voice cold and final. "You dare take what belongs to the sea? Then to the sea you shall return." The rock began to tremble and cracks spread across its surface as if the very world were rejecting Kane's claim. The monolith began to sink, and water rushed over their feet. Bryn wrestled with Kane, desperately trying to pry the ruby from his captain's hands. In a final act of defiance, Bryn tore the ruby from Kane's grip and hurled it into the depths below. The ruby sank, its glow fading, and as it disappeared, the drums ceased. Crow's ship halted, and a low whisper of anguish filled the air as the ghostly crew faded, returning to the watery graves from which they'd risen. The widow's fury, now free of the spectral weight dragging it down, rocked violently on the waves as the crew scrambled aboard. The storm lifted, the fog dissipating as sunlight broke through, illuminating the cursed waters one last time. Kane, chest heaving, glared at Bryn with an intensity born of loss and fury. "You've cost us everything," he spat, voice barely a whisper. Bryn, exhausted and relieved, met his gaze with steel. "I saved our lives, Captain. Some treasures are better left to the dead." But even as he spoke, they both knew that something had changed between them, something that could never be mended. The crew, silent and weary, turned their faces toward the open sea, glad to leave Skull Reef behind but forever scarred by the horrors they had faced. As the widow's fury sailed away, Kane stood at the helm, his gaze fixed on the horizon, haunted by the ghostly drums that seemed to echo faintly in the distance, a reminder of the fortune he'd touched and lost. They had escaped the curse of Skull Reef, but none would leave unmarked. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting its final glow over the widow's fury as it cut through the open sea, leaving the cursed waters of Skull Reef behind. The crew moved about the deck in silence, every man's face drawn, as if marked by a shadow that could never be erased. The horrors they'd faced lingered in their minds, the hollow eyes of Crow's crew, the unearthly beat of the ghostly drums, and the cursed ruby, gleaming like an infernal star before it vanished into the depths. Captain Dante Kane stood at the helm, gripping the wheel with a fury that rippled through his entire frame. His dreams of treasure had slipped through his fingers like sand, leaving only resentment and a bitter emptiness. Beside him, Bryn Stone stood watchful and unyielding, his presence a silent reminder of the choice he had made to save them all. Between them, a chasm yawned wider than any ocean, one that loyalty and years of camaraderie would never bridge again. As dusk fell, the tension aboard the ship was almost unbearable. Rafe, the young sailor who'd barely escaped the ghostly clutches of Crow's crew, approached Bryn, his face pale. "Is it over then?" he asked in a low, trembling voice. "We won't hear those drums again, will we?" Bryn placed a reassuring hand on the lad's shoulder. "Aye, it's over. Crow's gone back to his grave, and his curse with him." He tried to keep his voice steady, though he himself was haunted by the memory of the Phantom Fleet and the look of betrayal in Kane's eyes. Night blanketed the ship, and as the crew settled into a tense quiet, whispers began to stir among them. They'd followed Kane for years, surviving countless raids and storms. But this curse had changed them all. Men gathered in hushed groups, muttering to each other, their loyalty to Kane shattered like a broken compass. Some cast wary glances at Bryn, whose defiance had saved them, but who now seemed poised to challenge Kane's authority. Kane, sensing the shift in the crew's loyalty, called them to attention. His voice rang out, filled with a desperation thinly masked as authority. "I know you men have your doubts, but remember, without me, you'd be scavenging for scraps in port towns and running from every Navy ship that crossed our path. I've led you to riches before, and I'll lead you to them again." But his words fell flat, the echoes swallowed by the sea. The men's eyes shifted, avoiding his gaze, and Kane realized then that the trust he'd once commanded was gone, replaced by a fear that had nothing to do with Crow's curse and everything to do with his own reckless obsession. He looked to Bryn, and the two locked eyes, a silent, bitter acknowledgement of all that had been lost. In the days that followed, Bryn took on more of the duties Kane once performed, his steady hand and calm nature earning the respect of the crew. Kane grew more isolated, his fury simmering, casting suspicious glances at Bryn and the men who now seemed to gravitate toward the first mate. The distance between the two finally snapped one dark, storm-tossed night. As lightning streaked across the sky, Kane confronted Bryn on the quarterdeck, his voice low and venomous. "You think you can just take my crew from me, Bryn?" he snarled. "I gave you everything, taught you how to fight, how to lead, and this is how you repay me? By stealing the loyalty of my men?" Bryn met his gaze steadily, undeterred. "It wasn't your men I saved, Captain. It was every soul aboard this ship, including you. You were too blinded by greed to see the danger. That curse would have claimed us all if I hadn't acted." Kane's face twisted. Torn between rage and a flicker of the guilt he refused to acknowledge. "You think you're better than me? That you could lead this ship?" He laughed bitterly. "The sea doesn't belong to the cautious, Bryn. It belongs to those bold enough to take what they want. And sometimes it's that boldness that sinks a man," Bryn replied. "Look around you, Kane. The men don't trust you anymore. They saw what you were willing to sacrifice for that cursed treasure." "I only did what any man with a sense of loyalty would do." Kane's face darkened, and his hand strayed to the hilt of his cutlass, fingers twitching with the urge to draw. The two men stood, eye to eye, with only the storm between them. But before either could move, the ship shuddered, hit by a massive wave, and the tension broke as they staggered to regain their balance. At that moment, a cry rang out from the crow's nest. "Ship on the horizon. It's the Black Wind." Every man on deck turned to look. The Black Wind was an infamous Navy frigate, known for hunting down pirate ships with relentless precision. The crew scrambled to their stations, but the long days at sea and their recent encounter with Skull Reef had left the Widow's fury battered and weakened. They'd never outrun the Navy's ship in their current state. Kane snapped back into command, his anger forgotten in the face of imminent danger. "Men, prepare for battle. We may be cursed, but we won't go down without a fight." The crew, despite their doubts, rallied around their captain one last time, scrambling to load the cannons and arm themselves. Bryn took his place at the bow, barking orders, his presence a steadying force as they prepared to face their mortal enemies. As the Black Wind closed in, the first cannonball struck, tearing through the Widow's fury with a thunderous impact. Splinters flew, and the ship rocked as the men returned fire, fighting with a desperation born from a fear that ran deeper than any Navy threat. They battled fiercely, their actions a testament to the resilience of men who'd faced the supernatural and lived to tell the tale. But the fight was one-sided. The Black Wind was well-armed and fully manned, its cannons firing with deadly precision. One by one, the men fell, their blood staining the deck. Kane fought like a demon, refusing to surrender, his defiance a final testament to the man he was. But even his resolve could not change the inevitable. As dawn broke, the Widow's fury was reduced to a battered wreck, listing dangerously in the water. The crew that remained surrendered, knowing that to fight further was to die. Kane, bloodied and beaten, finally laid down his sword, casting one last defiant look at Bryn. In that glance was a lifetime of rivalry, a bond of loyalty broken by greed, and the realization that Kane's dream had cost them everything. Bryn, equally exhausted and bloodied, nodded solemnly. They'd lost their ship, their treasure, and their crew, but they'd survived the curse that had claimed so many before them. In the end, the Navy took what was left of the Widow's fury, and Kane, along with the remnants of his once loyal crew, faced the uncertain fate that awaited them in chains. Bryn, his spirit hardened but his conscience clear, watched as they were led away, feeling the weight of all that had been sacrificed. And as the waters of Skull Reef faded into the distance, Bryn couldn't shake the echo of those ghostly drums, a warning that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The cursed treasure was gone, and so was the Widow's fury. But the memory of that night, the legends, the faces of the damned, and the drums of Crow's ghostly fleet would live on in the hearts of those who survived. The sea had claimed its toll, leaving only whispers of haunted treasure and the ghosts who guard it, forever bound to Skull Reef. If you've made it this far, fellow adventurer, you're braver than most. Don't forget to subscribe to You Pirate for more tales of the high seas, where treasures and terrors await those daring enough to chase them. Share this with your mates and keep the legend alive. Who knows what cursed waters we'll brave next?